Our guest today is president of the Chicago Teachers Union. Here are a few facts about our speaker today. Number one, he taught social studies at Senn High School and Chicago Vocational Career Academy, where he also coached chess. Number two, our guest today represents the CTU on the American Federation of Teachers Executive Council and sits on the AFT Executive Board. Number three, he earned both his bachelor's and master's degrees from Brown University, where he studied history and education. Number four, our guest today lives with his wife, Julie, and two children in Rogers Park. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jesse Sharkey. Jesse?
CTU? Thank you, Jay, for that kind introduction. I should say just off the start that I spoke to Karen at some length last night, hoping for a little of her wisdom and charm to rub off on me. And she told me to say hello. She said that she has a glue gun and sequins, and she's trying to bling out her gait belt. And then she said, if you think she's bad, that I'm Jean-Jacques Dessalines. And you guys don't know who that is, but you should. I'm a history teacher, so you should look it up. It's your homework. Anyway, thanks to the City Club for the opportunity to speak. Start my timer here. I will say that just off the bat, though, that in moments like this, I do miss Paul Green. Dr. Green really has would have, I think, appreciated the kind of political moment that we're in. He had so much warmth and a rich sense of humor. My remarks today are going to hold up our vision of a public school system that brings high-quality public education to every student, that unlocks the human potential of all of our students and all of our children. That vision requires a city that confronts economic inequality and racism. It requires a commitment to grassroots democracy. It requires resources. It requires that our movements grow, not just in their numbers, but in their political maturity and in their political independence. Schools train the future generation. The success of our children, that is inextricably bound up in the success of our city, and whether or not we have a city that we're proud of and that succeeds into the future. To put it in more analytic terms, I want to spend some time looking at the relationship between the schools, the CTU, and our social movements on the one hand, and on the other hand, the school's newly elected mayor, CPS, and the city's unelected and semi-permanent power structure. The way I see this playing out in terms of the next teacher's contract and the politics in the city over the next several months, that's really what I'm going to try to dig into today. I want to, though, sort of begin when we're thinking about where we're going, to sort of mention that it's useful to think about where we come from. And in 2010, when Karen and I came into office, there were storm clouds brewing over public education. Arnie Duncan had just come into power in Washington, D.C., and he came there to export a teacher-blaming and charter school and test score competition model to the rest of the country. The effects of the 2008 economic crash were hitting hard. So there was a new breed of education reformers, and they were talking about doing a whole series of changes in our schools with no funds. In fact, the funding from schools across this country has not yet gotten back to the point now in 2019 that it was before 2008. And so the way they were going to achieve these changes was by privatizing services, by promoting teacher bashing, and sort of giving us a steady diet of nonstop standardized tests. Soon we had Rahm and Rauner here locally planning our demise. Now fast forward to 2019. Rauner is gone, Rahm is leaving, and we're still here. We've organized hundreds and hundreds of charter educators into the union movement. We've seen the proliferation of charter schools has slowed. Our national conversation about education is shifting. Gone is Michelle Rhee, the swaggering CEO of the DC schools, famous for firing teachers and opening charter schools, who stood on the cover of Time magazine with a broom. She's been replaced now with struggling teachers in red shirts, going out on picket lines and demonstrations across the country, from West Virginia to Arizona to LA, back to Virginia, and I will say in many ways starting here in Chicago. The local conversation about education has shifted too. The mayor-elect copied and pasted much of our platform into her policy goals. She will need us to meet these goals. She will need us to meet them. We have not only carried the message of justice and equity, we have carried with our coalition the mantle of the organizing work. And frankly, we bore a burden during a whole period of time in which these policy goals were not popular, in which it was not outwardly apparent that there was a large pool of support for the things for which we were fighting. It was not considered popular, nor was it considered wise politically. And yet still, those goals have come to the front and won. And so it's useful to take a quick case study of Rahm Emanuel, because I think his tenure is illustrative for us in a number of ways. I mean, here's a guy who was in an incredibly strong position, presiding over a historically booming economy, with the support of the business community and a portion of labor. And the guy, had many flaws, but being a bad fundraiser wasn't one of them. He was loaded with money, and now he's out. And I think the problem there was not just that, as Lori Lightfoot aptly put it, that he led with his middle finger. I mean, which he did do. It's that he had the outlook of a technocratic and pushy middle manager. He lacked the vision of a city which would inspire regular people, because his vision didn't include a place for regular people like those in the CTU. Not just the people who work in the schools, but who fix the streets, who open the shops, who staff the offices, or as Bob Ryder on the CFL has put it, the people from the airline attendants and bricklayers to the window washers and xylophonists, sort of the Ada X, I guess, of the labor movement in Chicago, the working class base of the city that sends their kids to public school, many of whom are Black and Latino, most of whom have been left out by the so-called economic progress and policies that Rahm promoted. Carrie Liderson, in her book about Rahm, titled it Mayor 1%. Because that's the outlook he reflected. He carried water for and represented Chicago's elites. And I don't want to go too much into depth. If people want to read more about kind of where corporations are at in terms of the way they think about education, you should look at Professor Pauline Littman's work, or Dorothy Shipp's has a great book on school reform, corporate style in Chicago. But the corporate and financial sectors, although they're not monolithic, they want low taxes and high rates of return on investments. They don't want to pay for anything. They don't want to pay for anything. They want to remake government in their own image. So you have this virtual parade of billionaires, sort of direct rule by billionaires, from Bloomberg in New York to Rauner in Illinois, including Trump and now Pritzker. And so you have these costly and ineffective privatization schemes, from the parking meters to the janitorial services in schools. And public expenditures, which are called investments, right? They're used to promote profit-making enterprise, like Lincoln Yards. Developments which I think would have been built anyway, and frankly, but not adequate social services, spent, as far as I can tell, spending on social workers or counselors or special ed services or the like. Something else about this group of people in Chicago. They don't like to be called out on racism, despite the fact that we live in a city where huge swaths of this city are effectively segregated, separate and unequal, lacking investment, jobs, and adequate services. Instead, we get policing. As W.E.B. Du Bois said, the police come to view black neighborhoods the way an invading army views occupied territory. That will never be a solution to the ills of Chicago. That can never be our vision for what will make the city better and sustainable and a place where everyone wants to live. We have to do better. So I think in the end, his decision not to run was a result of that disconnect, the tension between Rahm's program and who that program was who that program represented, what class interest that program represented, and the disconnect between that and the people who would have to vote for him. And frankly, I think it's hard to be mayor and to go everywhere you go when there's someone picketing you or interrupting your speeches or refusing to shake your hands. I think that must have an effect on him. And so really, it's like, why isn't Rahm still the mayor? It has to do because there were a handful of unions and the social movements who opposed him and who spoke out for a different version of the city. They were active. They were marching in the streets. They were sitting in. And that's why he's out. And as Howard Zinn, the famous historian and social justice activist, once said, it's not who's sitting in office, it's who's sitting in. And I do want to come back to that point again in a minute. I will just speak briefly about the CTU's political style, because, this is an organization, the CTU, we don't play it safe so much, do we? And we do make waves. There's another part of that. Look, this is a union that believes in movement politics, in a movement that's designed to build a better world, block by block, school by school, and it makes us odd and puts us out of step with a lot of other parts of the political establishment in the city. But we don't apologize for that. It's based on some principles. And we alluded to the idea that we see our strength representing our members, that's bound up in the idea that support for public education and the community that supports public education, that is our strength. And it's the basis of why we do what we do. And the public support for that project is part and parcel of our ability to represent our members in their workplaces. Those things can't be separated. It means support for our schools in the form of revenue, and it means democracy in this city. And by the way of democracy, I mean very explicitly an elected representative school board, which is something that we need. It's a voting rights issue in the city. It's a voting rights issue in a city that's dominated by Black and Latinx parents who have been shut, and it's a bill that's passed the House 3 separate times. Thank you, Rob Martwick, as the chief sponsor of that. A lot of other people have worked on that as well. Too many to list here. And we expect Lori Lightfoot to make good on her promise to work with our coalition and pass a bill that provides fair representation in the schools to the residents of our city, and to make that into law. The CTU supports the current legislation, not only because it's the actual bill that exists, but because we're not scared of 21 representatives. Frankly, that's the number of state reps Chicago has. And we think that our district should be small enough so that a board member can walk through their district, knock on the doors, and listen to the parents. We think that the different neighborhoods in the city should be represented on a body like that, from the west side to the lake, from Rogers Park down to Hegwich, and everything in between. So and the way you get that is by having a board that's large enough to represent that diversity. Because a lot of different schools and a lot of different communities in Chicago. And by the way, we would also, one of the other things that marks our political style is that we reject double standards. We reject the idea that there's one set of rules for everybody else and a different set where there's fewer rights and less voice for the people in Chicago. And that means restoring the bargaining rights of this union in the city of Chicago. The right to bargain over class size, and other pertinent issues like subcontracting. Those rights were taken away in 1995 in what was a deal between then Mayor Daley and the Republican leadership of the legislature at the time, and they've never been restored, despite the fact that we have Democrats in both houses and a Democrat who's been sitting as mayor for pretty much the whole time since. It's time to end that double standard and restore our rights. Because when Karen and I came into office in 2010, we would often say to each other that there's a good chance that we're only going to be in office for one term. We would say that. Not because we lacked intelligence or drive to do the office, but because we were clear that we were willing to take serious organizational risks and have a fight in which the outcome wasn't clear in advance, in which it seemed like the forces arrayed against us were much greater than the forces that were under our control. And I'll skip many of the details. But I will say this, that if our members had failed to respond and failed to strike, if we had failed to mobilize against the school closings that came in 2013, the face of the city would have been much different. Rahm would still be the mayor, probably. And we wouldn't have what we have now, which is a burgeoning movement of activists rooted in social movements going into government, going into City Hall in order to try to make our city better for everybody. And I just want to lift that up for a second, because there's a new generation of aldermen here and a group of state representatives who've done admirable work and who are trying to change the system so that we get a city that works for everybody. And so I want to sort of tip my hat to a couple of the incumbents who are here. Sophia King, Alderman Carlos Rosa, I don't think made it, was on my list. But certainly to Alderman-elect Jeanette Taylor and Byron Sigcho and Daniel Espada and Matt Martin and Rosanna Rodriguez and Jeanette Taylor. I thank you guys. You inspire me. Into our state reps, Rob Martwick, Ann Williams, Delia Ramirez. You guys are great. But what I want to remind everyone here is that the strength of people in office doesn't come from the office by itself. It comes from the social movements that support us. It comes from our working class base. We're able to be effective because we have a vision that this city has to be a great city for everyone. That what equality and justice means has to stretch into Black and Latino working class neighborhoods on the south sides and west sides, not just into the Loop. And we're going to fight for a set of policies together, both in the State House, in the City Hall, and in the streets and the unions, and at the bargaining table that lifts that up and makes it into a reality. So we're looking forward to having that fight side by side and together. Right? Third, I want to talk about our new mayor-elect, Lori Lightfoot, a little bit. First of all, congratulations if you're listening, Mayor-elect Lightfoot. Congratulations on your victory. I do not envy the task that you had before you. I don't. There are a lot of competing pressures. There are the goals and aspirations that you captured in your campaign so brilliantly, and then there's the goals and aspirations of your donor base. And those two things are in contradiction. And it goes back to what I said about rahm. I've spent my life trying to build movements, the labor movement in particular, based on my understanding that broad forces are people are needed to be in motion in order to get deep and meaningful change. When you look at someone like Mayor Lightfoot coming into office, they don't pass out a magic wand when you take the keys to the 5th floor of City Hall. There's no magic wand included. No magical power to achieve policy goals. That requires the mobilization of people in neighborhoods, in organizations like unions, to take on a series of vested interests in this city that are still very much there. So we want to work with this mayor to bring transparency to the schools. This mayor is going to need unions, especially the public sector unions. Let's start with the bargaining process. The mayor-elect has said that she wants to bring teachers and the voice of people into that process. Great. Let's start with some open bargaining. Let's have some sessions in which all CPS employees can come. Let's have some sessions in which parents and members of the community can come, see what we do at the bargaining table. We also need to make more progress. We would like to see some of the changes that she has talked about in her policy platform, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We would like to see those things go into effect for the start of next school year. We want to land this process. So what are some of those things? Basic educational supports. She's called for nurses, counselors, and social workers to be in our schools, in every school. And for nurses, not just, okay, there's a nurse there, but they're only there on Tuesday. It doesn't count. I want a nurse, I shouldn't have to say it this way, but there should be a nurse, a school nurse in every school, Monday through Friday, in every school in the city. She's called for, it's part of our contract demands, let's get it done so we can implement it. Lori Lightfoot has also called for training and comprehensive efforts to deal with trauma. The thought of educating students, when there's literally thousands of people a year being shot, hundreds being killed, and those students deal with that in their home life, or maybe among people who they go to school with, and then come back to school and are expected to grind for the test the next day with no service and no support, that's unconscionable. We need to stop that in a first world country. We have contract demands in these areas too. And by the way, restorative justice is not something which you do because you show someone a video about it and you hand out a certificate after a half an hour long training program. You need actual staff that are trained in how it works. You need a recurrent commitment to that. There needs to be resources put to it, time for professional development. That's how restorative justice works. Again, we have contract demands about it. Mayor-elect Lightfoot has said that it's a concern of hers. Let's get it done. We agree on that. Community schools. The CTU has created a sustainable community schools program in which 20 schools, each of which is partnered with a community organization that has deep roots in the surrounding communities and neighborhoods. And that those schools, in those schools, the administration, unionized staff, parents, and other community partners work together to make collective decisions about what's best in those schools. And there's a small amount of resources, and that program works. It's a proven program. Our students and teachers deserve to see it expanded in the next contract. Again, we have a demand about it. Let's see it happen. And I want to start wrapping up my remarks here. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention to people, probably many of whom are aware, the CTU has a contract which expires at the end of this June, at the end of school year this year. I'm talking about our contract in terms of the Mayor-elect's program, but there's also a series of things that our members are concerned about, who are the heart and soul of our school communities. The people who teach every day, the people who do the clinical work, and the PSRPs, the paraprofessionals that actually staff our buildings, who are the clerks that work in the offices, the teachers' assistants in the classrooms, and do everything in between. Pay and benefits are an issue. We've seen 2 freezes in the last 4 years in furloughs. So you're going to say that we need higher pay. We're not going to apologize for asking for fair pay. We're not. We live in a city in which teachers make far less than the 1/3 of city workers who make over $100,000 a year, who make far less than police and firefighters. And it is not lost on us that that has something to do with the fact that teaching is a female-dominated profession, and we live in a society where the power structure is dominated by white men. And it's not fair that people should take a $10,000 or $20,000 or $30,000 a year pay differential because they do what's considered women's work and inferior work. It's not. We need frontline workers who run into burning buildings. That's true. And we need incredibly skilled teachers who know how to teach students who are picking up the pieces when they have to go into school the next day. And I'll tell you, those are both hard jobs, and they both deserve fair pay. I've mentioned, in addition to pay, though, I also need to say this, that I gave a speech at the City Club back in 2015 in the summer. And one of the things I said in it is that CPS had just passed a budget that was $480 million out of balance, in which they said they were going to balance that budget by passing a law in Springfield that would supply the money. And of course, that never happened, did it? And so what happened is that in 15 and 16, our schools were slashed, cut to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. You've read about it on the front pages in terms of special ed, but you might not be aware of how many school support staff or PSRPs were cut, how many librarians were laid off, just the incredible way in which we're now running bare-bones schools that are understaffed. That has to be restored. We need to restore the critical staffing shortages in our schools. It has to happen. We need to address class size, which has been going up in the city of Chicago since 1995 when that law passed, and that was removed as something we could bargain about. And then finally, we need to address a number of what we're calling social demands, things that affect both our members in schools and the communities that surround those schools. So, for example, affordable housing. I'd like to hear about the city's commitment both to teachers who are being priced out, who live in the city by ordinance, but who can't afford to live in the city. And if teachers can't afford to live in the city, how do working class people in the service sector afford to live in the city? We have to address that. Those are our students, need to be able to live here as well. We also want to talk about things like community schools and sanctuary provisions to protect our immigrant students. That's something, all those things tie into our contract. And I was going to spend more time, I think, frankly, talking about how we can afford those demands. But I will say this, Lincoln Yards in the 78. No, I mean, really, like if we can afford to put, I don't know, what's the latest number, $1.6 billion or so? If we can put that into developments for profitable companies that were happening already, then I know there's money to afford the demands for our schools. End of conversation. The money's there. We expect it. 1.6 billion. You're going to hear that number from me more than once. Unless someone convinces me it's a different number, and then I'll just use that number. You get my point. So what happens next? And I'll wrap up on these thoughts. Like I said, negotiations need to speed up. We want to conclude them as schools beginning next year. We think it's bad for our schools if we don't conclude negotiations. We deserve to know that we're going to be staffed, how we're going to be programmed, and we think there's political will to do it. Let's get it done. We're going to be asking to bring in a mediator by May 1st, a mediator that's going to help move things forward and that is in accord with the framing state statute. Mayor-elect Lightfoot has also said she wants to involve teachers. We want to take her up on that. Let's schedule some bargaining sessions in which, in some large venues like our hall or a similar venue, in which we can bring some teachers to hear that. And also let's have some that members of the community, parents and whatnot, and other interested parties can come to attend. I think our contract negotiations need to be viewed in a broader context about a sea change in politics that's happening in the city. A mayor whose platform is in alignment with our schools, with our vision of schools that our children deserve, but whose donor base isn't. A group of elected officials that are part of a social movement to make things better. We need to broaden and deepen movements, not just the movement for educational justice, but the movement for justice in terms of dealing with police, for the immigrant community, for the labor movement broadly, all those things. Our relationship with the mayor remains to be seen, but our relationship to each other is a source of strength and hope and inspiration for us going forward. We can build a city that works for everyone. It's in the benefit of working class people across this city. That's our vision. That's what we intend to do. And together I know that we can achieve that. Thank you. I got some here.
Okay, thank you, President Sharkey. And we've got some questions here. This is from Thomas Brown. This question actually was submitted via email. And his question is, he's affiliated with Edge Annuity. K-12 students are digital natives. What steps is CTU taking to support student success with online instruction? What steps is CTU taking to assist members effectively and efficiently to integrate digital instruction into daily instruction?
Good. Well, I'm glad for the question. As the parent of two children who are glued to their electronic devices, not only do I approach this question professionally, I approach this question personally as well. I will tell you this, that the first thing is that we do need to have modern technology in our classrooms as part of our instruction. But it does not supplant or replace the need to have qualified instructors who build human relationships with students. And too often technology is seen as a shortcut or a crutch. And I'll give you an example of that. In Illinois, there's a test called the Work Keys, part of which is the ACT, the other part of it is the job readiness test. And every junior has to take it. And I taught juniors for a long time. And so in order to prepare people for this test, the school system bought a computer program. And so 1 day out of 5, I was mandated to bring my class to the computer lab to practice taking the Work Keys test. And what students would do is they would go through a lesson that simulated test questions. And then at the end, after they'd completed the questions, it would email to me a sort of a submission of how they did. But the people who made the program didn't realize, and students realized it within about 5 minutes, that you could simply click the different multiple choice questions, and it would pop up wrong, 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 until you got to the right one, and then it would click right. And so in every given day, the students could complete the lesson, right, in about 3 minutes, because they would just figure out that they could just click through without even having to read them, and it would mark successfully completed, right? And then they would use the rest of the time browsing the internet to do whatever they wanted to do on the internet. And of course, I'm paying attention to my class. I know this is going on. But now instead of like me being able to go in my classroom where I can deliver actually on-task instruction, related to sets of standards, I have to go monitor 30 students in a computer lab who have a dumb assignment that I'm now required to do because the system has bought this stupid piece of software, right? That's ineffective and doesn't work. And I can tell you all the different ways in which that's being replicated, whether it's through the way people are teaching math online, et cetera. Also, much of our technology is out of date. Like CPS just put forward a new digital parent and teacher portal called Aspen. Spent a lot of money on it. It's an integrated platform. But because CPS either couldn't find or wouldn't spend the money on something that was up to date, you get on this thing and it looks 12 years old. And 12 years old in technology terms might as well be an IBM Selectric typewriter, right? I mean, it doesn't work. It's not designed well for what it's supposed to do. And so it's like, if we want to do high quality digital instruction, we got to actually spend the resources to get that to be up to date. And then we got to design it to work in conjunction with classroom teachers so that it aids our instruction, doesn't try to supplant it. So the CTU is advocating for those things. It's something that we care a lot about. There's a number of things which both the CTU and the AFT, our parent union, is doing in terms of electronic instruction. We want to continue pushing for that. Resources coming into the schools to invest in proper technology helps, but technology by itself is not a panacea. In fact, it can often be a problem.
Okay, thank you. We have a number of questions here. This is from Stephanie Trussell with WLS AM 890 Radio. Stephanie, where are you? Okay. Stephanie, you're not a member of the City Club. We've had a number of your questions. $50, you pay up or your question gets thrown away in the future. Okay? Good. We're tough here.
Yeah,
got a bar. Here's her question. It's a good question. There are models in CPS which are top performing. Whitney Young, Walter Payton are just two. How will the union address high schools labeled low performing?
I mean, the first thing I would say is that neighborhood schools have to be respected and given the tools they need to succeed in the same way that the selective enrollment schools like Payton and Whitney Young are given. I live in Rogers Park. My neighborhood school is Sullivan. There's some people here who. That's right. Sally mentioned Sullivan. You know what? It was a great school. It was a great school when it was a neighborhood school for everyone in Rogers Park. And what's happened is that there have been two competing charter schools and then a number of other CPS schools that have opened magnet programs that selectively pull kids out of Rogers Park. And now Sullivan is struggling to survive. It's freshman enrollment. There's a building that was built for what, like 1,200, something like that?
Yeah, it was originally a junior high school.
Right. I mean, we're talking about a building that could easily hold 1,000. I want to say there's maybe 300 students in that school. And I can remember meeting the former alderman of the 49th Ward and saying, you're supporting the growth of all these charter schools. What's going to happen to Sullivan? What's going to happen to the neighborhood school? It's being starved of resources. It's poorly, it isn't being supported the way it needs to be supported. And he said, I don't care. It's not in my ward. What? Okay, thanks. That's the one obvious thing to say about that is that neighborhood schools really can succeed. They need to be an important model because that's the place that becomes a nexus for the way the people who live around a school, community organizations and whatnot, make connection back to parents, and it's worth investing in. Last thing I'll just mention is that one of the things that hurt us here is the way in which CPS apportions funding to schools. So that like a school in a big new modern facility like Whitney Young that can always fill its ranks because of selective enrollment, everyone wants to go there, gets money based on how many students it puts in. And it has fewer students that are truly difficult to educate, whether because there's concentrations of poverty, English language learners, special ed kids, special ed students whose IEPs are very resource intensive. CPS just gives a student-based budgeting formula. It's a flat formula. It's a state, we have something called an evidence-based budgeting model that actually tries to put resources into schools on that basis. If we adopt the state model in CPS, something along those lines, we'd be better off and better positioned to succeed in this.
Okay, thank you, Jesse. This is from Allison Jack. Allison, where are you? Right here. Right here. She's with INCS. Same offer to you that I just made to Stephanie Trussell. See, we have very stringent requirements to join the 2,400 people that are members of the City Club. 50 bucks. Cash, credit, whatever. Bingo. No DNA testing or anything like that. Okay. Here's her question, Jesse.
Yeah.
Given teachers in 33% of the city's public charter schools are unionized, and those schools just received a 20 to 40% cut in their fourth quarter payment, what will be CTU's reaction to this?
So people who aren't aware, there has been a series of changes in the funding formula to charter schools in particular. And one of the things which happened last year is that there was an increase in funding to charter schools. I want to say that it was, and by our calculation, it was 8% over what CPS schools received. And CPS, which is the institution responsible for actually distributing these funds, noticed that this was actually out of compliance with the state law the way it existed. And so told charter employers that, like, we might take this money back from you. And look, this is a terrible practice. It shouldn't be the case that you give schools money and then say, by the way, halfway through the school year, we're going to take it back. That's not a great practice. But what needs to happen is that the law, we need an equitable law for funding of charter schools and, frankly, all district schools. And there shouldn't be special favorites in which one group gets more than the other. If you're a public school student, you should get a fair amount of funding, and that funding should support high-quality schools. And so the direct answer is we're going to support legislation in Springfield that fixes it and gets it right. We're not going to support legislation that gives special sets of rights to charter schools that district schools don't have. But you're right, we have many members in the charter sector, and frankly, there are many public school students in charter schools that deserve fair treatment. And so that's the position we're going to take on that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. This is from City Club member Mark Weyermuller. Mark Wary, right over there. In your case, we're going to up you. Okay. His question is, with property tax payments in mind, would you support changing state law so new teachers can go to a 401k to start a phase out of what he calls the pension mess?
No.
Okay, so you heard that from Leader Durkin the other day, Mark. You now hear it from President Sharkey. You've got to come up with a different question the next time you come. Okay. And why not?
Yeah, no. Why not? I mean, I'll tell you why not. 401ks are a substantial attack on the pensions of public sector employees who make less money than their private sector counterparts. And one of the things that we get in return for that is a secure retirement. Don't get Social Security, right? A lot of things we don't get, but a public sector pension that's fair was part of the contract. 401ks will undermine that in a significant way, partly because it means that new people coming in will no longer pay into that fund. And so as you wind that out into the future, right, you have an increasingly smaller and smaller group of people with no new members coming in to help help keep alive the funding for our retirees. And frankly, we think they're a big benefit to the individual fund managers who manage all those 401k accounts. We think it's a good way to take funds away from the people who are public servants and frankly what are well-managed funds and redistribute them to a section of financial services. We think it's a bad idea.
Okay, so I think Charlie Gardner, who's a life trustee of Roosevelt University, that was your question. And also, several people here are interested in questions, and pensions, and that, but this is a little different slant. It's from Regina O'Connor. She's with the CTU. Regina, where are you? Oh, okay, via Facebook. Terrific. Why was CTU late with pension payments? And what was the rationale behind voting themselves a waiver?
The CTU has a very, very long, strong record of supporting our pension fund, both in terms of the legislation in Springfield and in terms of supporting that fund in a lot of ways. Over half the trustees are members of the CTU, I know there was a mix-up in which we made a payment late, and we were fined for it.
Okay. In the mayoral election, the CTU did not support the winning candidate. You supported President Toni Preckwinkle. A lot of money were given to her campaign. Many workers, I'm not sure how many teachers followed your advice. If you look at the results, probably not that many. But my question really is, since the election, have you or members of your leadership team talked with Mayor-elect Lightfoot? Have anyone on her staff, her key people, reached out to you and started talking with each other?
So our staffs have met. Mayor-elect Lightfoot staff and the CTU key people on our staff have met and talked. I'll be looking forward to sitting down with Mayor Lightfoot when it makes sense for that to happen. I will say that I can't resist a little comment about the thing that you said first, which is just this, that, look, politics in Chicago, Paul Green would say there's no low blows. Mayor Washington would have said it ain't beanbag. Our union made a decision to endorse President Preckwinkle back in October based on her record and the representation she made about what she would do in office. It didn't work out that she won. She lost every ward in the city, right? That was an election. And now we have to go on and have a mature bargaining relationship with the new mayor. As I said before, this is a new mayor who a lot of her aspirations, if you read them on paper, line up with stuff that we think needs to happen. I've said that I think that the mayor is going to need us if she's actually going to carry those things out. But I'm also pointing out that her aspirations are in conflict with parts of the power structure in the city and her own donor base. And frankly, and if the election had gone the other way, so would Mayor-elect Preckwinkle's have been. And we would have been in a similar situation. We're a union. We represent workers. We represent working class people in the city of Chicago. We aspire to have great public schools for everyone, and we will do what it takes to bargain a hard contract and put forward our principles with whoever sits in that seat, and that's the way that we're going to do it. We're not going to be petty about it, and we're going to move forward. But we are going to be firm about our principles.
Okay, thank you, Jesse. Another question along that line, and I've got two more questions here. The elected school board. You've proposed, or at least if I heard you correctly, 21-member school board, publicly elected. I think last week, Mayor-elect Lightfoot went down to Springfield, where she talked with various legislators, the governor, and so on. And there are many people who feel that your model of the elected school board would be rather unwieldy, bureaucratic, and perhaps too costly. Would you care to respond to that? And is there any negotiation flexibility in the union's stated position on that?
I mean, one of the things I'll say is if you want to see an expensive school board, look at what they had in LA, where they spent $20 million on a school board election, 7 people. It was a big citywide districts. Big money came in. They spent $20 million on that race, and they got 10% turnout. You want to know why they got such low turnout? It's because the more money you pump into a race, the less people are convinced that their own individual voice matters. So it's not like you spend lots of money and that drives turnout up. You spend lots of money and it drives turnout down. We're convinced that having a school board that has representative districts that are small enough to have a real relationship between the person who represents the district and their neighborhood and their communities and those schools is actually going to help drive involvement in it up. Unwieldy, democracy is messy. The legislature is messy, but that's the size of our legislative contingent in Springfield, and they managed to actually run a legislature. City council is messy, and we have 50 wards. That is to say, I'm convinced that we can make it work. I mean, obviously, it requires that board to then appoint the CEO, or hopefully a superintendent, but that board to appoint a leader who can actually lead the district. And we're not talking about having a 21-headed school department. It needs to still have an administration, right? But I think you can have a board that does that. And finally, you asked me, are we willing to compromise about it? I mean, legislation is about compromise. But I'm really hesitant to say, oh yeah, let's compromise away this. People are counterposing a bill that we don't, a bill we don't have that would once again put off the ability to have an elected school board with one that we do have that's gone through the legislative process for years. Look, we've got something that would work, that's passed the House multiple times, that's on the table. We need to put it into practice. We need to put it into law. We need to make this happen. If someone legitimately wants to come with a tweak about it, look, that's what the legislative process is for. We'll be willing to engage in that. But I'm awfully suspicious that what we're seeing is people raising objections that it's not a perfect enough circle for the purpose of putting this off yet again.
Okay, thank you, Jesse. This is from City Club member Bill Bergman, who's with Truth in Accounting. There's an oxymoron. Bill, where are you? Right over there. Okay.
The lies in accounting people are out of business.
Here's his question. Why is it appropriate for taxpayers to pay for education groups with their own views about social justice and equity when reasonable people disagree about what they mean? Should public education present differing views fairly?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you mean about correct. I mean, teachers in their classrooms have a responsibility to teach curriculum, which is decided by school districts, which ultimately should be democratically decided and elected. And so that's in terms of the classroom. In terms of the ways that a union like the CTU presents its opinions, I assure you there's a very democratic process by which the CTU picks its leadership. It can kind of be like a bruising, bare-knuckled process, actually. But the reason that you have a CTU that represents views about, saying our union needs to be rooted in the communities and serving schools and have a vision of social justice is because, frankly, our union tried it the other way for decades. In which, our union minded its business and, went along with the stuff that Daley was doing or whatnot. During that whole period of time, they funded our schools out of our pensions. And so the shortfall in the pensions was because they were diverting funds that should have gone there, in which they used those funds to go on a charter school building spree at the same time the school district was about to start losing people. Right? And so they made a really dumb decision to open 130 privately run charter schools at the same time they were getting ready to close 200 other schools, right? Without any real, talk about undemocratic, there was never any public discussion of that. Let's have a discussion. Should we go on a school building spree, even though we think that we're about to start losing students? That was never discussed publicly. So our union has actually come to an idea that we need to have a firm relationship with groups of people in the community precisely because we saw the way it wasn't working when we tried to just keep to a narrow business model. And so I would say that very much we're proud of the way that we stand for education justice. We're proud of that. We think it makes our movement stronger. We think it makes us more effective to represent people in the classrooms. And in terms of like the decisions about what gets taught in schools, that should be democratically decided too.
Okay, thank you, Jesse Sharkey.